Jack.
Levi.
The Book Club from Hell.
Hello everyone, this is Jack with the Book Club from Hell, a participant in one of modernity's most luxurious forms of expenditure, podcasting. This episode is about the first volume of Georges Bataille's The Accursed Share. Published in 1949, the first volume of The Accursed Share outlines Bataille's concept of general economy, an extremely different theory of economics, which places the activity which most would consider economic, restricted economy in Bataille's words, within a larger context of energy flows throughout the universe. The existence of a portion of energy, the accursed share, which cannot be productively used, demands acts of wasteful expenditure, expressed by various cultures in different ways. If you like what we're doing with this podcast and want to support us, we have a Patreon account, the link to which is in the show notes. We release bonus episodes on Patreon, you can hear upcoming episodes early, and we have weekly chats with subscribers about our most recent episodes. I've also published a novel called Tower, if you're interested in hearing more from me, and finally, we have a Discord server for this podcast, on which you can find Levi, me, and plenty of other degenerates who listen to the Book Club from Hell, the link to which is, once again, in the show notes. So, if you're ready to learn about potlach and human sacrifice, then listen on. Enjoy. The sexual act is in time what the tiger is in space. Within the first few pages of this book, Bataille lays out that that very transparent sentence and tells you that if you understand his book, you're going to understand that sentence. So by the end of this episode, I hope everybody listening understands what is meant by the sexual act is in time what the tiger is in space. Because of the structure of this book, because he lays out his theory of general economy within the first 2 chapters or so, and then spends the rest of the book giving examples of how it works in the world, you understand why the sexual act is in time what the tiger is in space pretty quickly, actually. It's I enjoyed that way of beginning a book. It's a provocation. It's at least initially completely mystifying, and it makes you want to know more. It makes you want to know what Bataille is on about talking about sexual acts and tigers.
It's actually a pretty good way to start a book, isn't it? Here's a really obscure statement. You'll understand if you commit to my book. You'll understand. You could just be completely frivolous about it, though. Just make you could be,
but Bataille did it well in that. If you haven't read the book and you come across that statement, it is completely meaningless. It just doesn't mean anything, and you can't really guess what it means without having read the book. I guess just randomly, if you have enough attempts, you'll just
if you have enough
get there at random.
It's like the typing monkeys, except if you have enough undergraduate students doing, I don't know, French literature or something, randomly guessing as to the meaning. Eventually, one of the undergraduates will guess what he means
come across it
over 1 billion years.
Yeah, so people who listen to this episode rather than reading this book will come to understand why sexual acts and tigers have so much to do with general economy, energy flows, the accursed share, expenditure, conspicuous waste, luxury, etc., etc.
And if you're lucky, maybe we'll throw in some potlach and Tibetan Buddhism as well.
Yeah.
What a wild ride. You guys are in for a time.
Yeah, this book is a book I really enjoyed. I'm still unclear as to how true I think it is, but at the very least, at absolute worst, this is a really beautiful and very satisfying system that I enjoy using to look at the world around me. Like that's the worst this gets. If it gets better, it might actually be true. I don't know. Like I'm still thinking through that.
I realize one of the core distinctions between the way that Jack, you and I think and interact with these books is I often take them really to heart as to an actual explanation of the world, and I think you're really good. And I have a suspicion it's part of the reason why you become a fiction writer.
It doesn't worry me if things are just clearly made up.
Yeah, but you quite enjoy just adopting the world as if it were true and then just exploring it. You definitely did that with Decline of the West. So I think that's good, because I just assume French philosopher discussing economics doesn't know what he's talking about. Yeah, okay, it's going to be false.
It's not.
It's not very open-minded. But it means that having this conversation with you means I get to open my mind.
I think it's a good dynamic,
you play
because
Bataille bot.
you restrain me from something that I'm very liable to do, where if I think an idea is sufficiently beautiful, I don't really worry too much about if it's true or not, or how much correspondence it has to the world.
Yeah.
It's like, if it were up to me with the Decline of the West stuff, it would just be me relaying uncritically his ideas. Be like, oh, how fun is this idea of Studio Brown and infinite blue-green?
Yeah,
so
and another...
It's good. It's good to have you around to go, okay, why is this
not true? Why? Maybe let's just unpack that a little bit. So in a parallel universe where you stayed a doctor, but you still had this underlying willingness to just adopt fantasy worlds as reality, there's a version of Jack who's a doctor who became...
There already exists a specialty for that.
And you read Decline of the West and became way too enthusiastic about Spengler. Whilst practicing
developed my own therapeutic doctrine based on Evelyn, Spengler, and Bataille.
whilst practicing in rural Victoria.
Rural Victoria. Someone comes in complaining of depression. I'm immediately like, have you ever considered giving all of your possessions to your enemies? Have you ever heard of potlach? No, I'm not writing you a prescription. I want you to conspicuously waste all objects of utility that you possess. That reference will make sense once we go into the Accursed Share.
So, why should listeners care about this book, other than trying to answer that first obscure statement? Understand?
I would have thought answering that first obscure statement is the entire motivation.
Why did we pick this book? We already read a Bataille book.
Yeah,
the
story of the eye. So, in part, it's just because I hear Bataille mentioned, and I hear the Accursed Share mentioned as either as a wacky economic theory or as a valuable way of viewing the world, depending on whom you ask. So that had me interested. I enjoyed Story of the Eye. I enjoyed the solar anus, despite not really getting what was going on. Although I would like to go back now and reread it, because I imagine I'll understand more of it. In terms of me personally, I find literature or philosophy written during or immediately after the two world wars really, really interesting, because it's actually the same problem situation that Junger was facing in the Forest Passage. These people had seen their homes annihilated by two cataclysms very, very close together in time, and were, for, I think, justifiable reasons, very scared of a third world war sweeping through their homes again. And I find it fascinating looking at the different ways that people approach this problem of, okay, how do we not obliterate ourselves again within the space of a few decades? Why would people who aren't me, why would they be interested in this? Putting aside the people who are just interested in continental philosophy, it's a fun system. I don't think it's particularly influential outside of continental spaces. I think this is a discretionary book. This is something you look into just if you find it interesting.
There's two things. Two other reasons why I think people should care. Well, one of them is to echo what you're already saying. it has been extremely eye-opening to read post-Second World War and sort of war during the sort of literature from Europe during the 30s and 40s. Junger, but also even Mishima, right? Out of Japan. Or Spengler. The world went completely insane in that period of history. And obviously it's going to have an effect on people, and it's actually been really eye-opening to see, oh no, this was a profoundly traumatic couple of decades there with the Depression and the wars and all that. And of course,
and one from which Europe still hasn't recovered from it.
Yeah. And you think of course, there must have been, it must have felt like you were going insane in Europe if you were somebody living amongst, the way that Junger puts it in The Forest Passage, the battle of like these titanic forces sweeping these ideas, sweeping through the population, capturing people's imaginations and motivating them to create machines of war and all that sort of stuff and destroy their homelands and whatnot. And it's made me realize, like, oh, on some level they were insane. You know, obviously a lot of amazing, cool stuff, really great things happen as well. But essentially it's not just only defined by war. But it's pretty compelling to read. Yeah, and you can really understand why maybe some people came up with some wacky ideas to try to figure out why the hell is this happening. Like, this is absolutely insane. Whether it's Spengler's attempt to understand what was happening or Bataille's attempt or whatever. The second thing is, the reason why you might be interested is if you are into Bitcoin and Austrian economics, as you might be.
This maps perfectly onto Bitcoin.
This is an alternative interpretation of economics.
This is the anti-Bitcoin. This is actually just the opposite of Bitcoin.
Yeah, it was quite fun to read.
Within the context of this, Bitcoin could actually be the greatest threat to global stability imaginable, because it's a function of accumulation that is really hard to subvert. So it's actually just building up explosive energy. Like, but I guess it could be squandered by you just spending it on stupid shit.
But spend it on porn.
Yeah, you could just spend it on porn. But then someone else just has the Bitcoin in their possession. The energy accumulation is still there. Actually, once we've laid out the principles of this book, we really should talk about Bitcoin from the perspective of the Accursed Share, because
next to modern applications of these ideas, I'm going to put Bitcoin.
Because Bitcoin raises all sorts of really funny questions if you just assume this book to be true.
Okay, what we should do, we should assume
if you
the book is true.
To be true, Bitcoin is like existentially threatening.
Yeah, no, actually it is. Okay, so what were your expectations going into this book, Jack?
So I've really enjoyed other things that Bataille has written. So I was looking forward to it from that perspective. A number of our listeners have read and really, really enjoyed this book, particularly Billy. Shout out to Billy, whose taste in books I tend to share, at least the ones he's mentioned on the Discord. So I was looking forward to it also in terms of that. We have just read Simulacra and Simulation by Jean Baudrillard, which contained interesting ideas, but I just loathe how it was written. The prose is just repulsive. It's so turgid. Because of my own prejudices, I just assumed that because Bataille is French, this book would be shockingly written as well. So I wasn't looking forward to that. Very pleasantly surprised by how it was written. Baudrillard, I get the impression, is just trying to confuse you with his writing, whereas Bataille in this book, it really feels like he has an idea that he wants to convey to you and is making a sincere attempt to convey that idea to you in language appropriate to the task, rather than just trying to bamboozle you by talking about orbital works and the desert of the real. etc., etc. So I was quite positive going into this book. What about you?
I was a little bit scared it was going to be like Baudrillard again.
Yeah.
But it wasn't.
Yeah. Yep.
And I was also somewhat uncertain because we read the story of the eye and it was very strange and kind of gross. And, like he's probably, I would say he's a good writer, but he's just a very odd person. So I didn't know.
Yeah.
And I have no reason to suspect he had any. I had no reason to expect him to say something really valuable about economics or energy because that wasn't his field. And I'm not sure that he actually spent a huge amount of time developing expertise in either of those fields. So for him to go from Story of the Eye to talking about a unified theory of energy and economics, I thought it was, let's see where this one goes. But you know what? Despite kind of not expecting much of him, I was pleasantly surprised by it's an interesting way to look at economics. And yeah, I wouldn't say it was whole cloth a terrible attempt at an esoteric fiction writer to get into philosophy of economics, I suppose.
Yeah. It's interesting thinking about his problem situation as well, because I guess as we said earlier about why the literary and artistic output of Europe, particularly in the first half of the 20th century, is so fascinating, is because it's addressing these problems of these two cataclysmic wars and intense political unrest. And that was the problem situation of this book too. So this book was published in 1949. And it's addressing many of the same problems that Ernst Junger was addressing in The Forest Passage. And I just find it interesting having read these two books so close together. They're addressing very similar problems, but just in totally different ways. So the problem situation is basically, with this book, what he's specifically trying to address is how, or at least to my mind, what he's really trying to address is how do you avoid another huge war? Because he saw war as, and we'll get into more detail on this, as a way of wastefully expending a portion of energy or a portion of accumulated energy or wealth that is impossible to expend in a useful way. And so he was developing this idea of general economy to make people realize that there is a portion of energy that can never be productively spent. And it's better to consciously spend it on wasteful things like the sacred, on sex, on art. Gift giving, rather than just letting it accumulate, then explode into war.
And become violent.
And so
energy expenditure.
Yeah. So this book, as weird as it is actually very practical, or it's oriented towards very practical ends. It was like he's trying to avoid World War III by letting people know, hey, you've got your restrictive economics. Those are good. They work. But you have to situate that within general economy, which involves energy flows not only over the surface of the Earth, but in the universe.
Yeah. So it's useful to think of this as a very strange, extremely French philosophical approach to solving a very concrete and practical problem. It's just he went about in a very continental philosophy sort of way. It's just very, very odd, but kind of weirdly endearing now that actually we framed it like that.
It's also funny, and again, this just plays into my, all of the stereotypes of different European countries that I've been developing while living in Europe, while living in contact with Europeans who all
developing and
intense stereotypes about every country or every group surrounding them. But Junger and Bataille's approaches to this problem just typify their national stereotypes. So what's the German approach to this problem? Realize that there is an unchanging world of being that is accessible through producing art, or at least art points the way, and you must retreat into that world of being and understand that the world of becoming around you is to a large extent an illusion. The French approach is to realize that actually having weird sex and making art is not only aesthetically important, but existentially important. And so you should have more weird sex and produce more art and engage in more activities of luxuriously wasting that which you would otherwise put towards productive uses.
There was a very funny, I've been looking at this German designer, Dieter Rams. I think that's how you spell Dieter. Dieter. Dieter Rams, who was one of the lead designers for was it Boss Dieter Rams. He to me, he's like one of the embodies the German spirit, and there's a great video of him just critiquing something in in a design workshop, and he's like, everything here is excessive, we must just get rid of everything. Nothing serves it. The only thing that we should have here is what's purposeful. And I think it's weird to say, but sometimes there are these really, really funny stereotypes like that, where it's ultimate German. It's just loves minimal design. And Junger was another aspect of the German spirit as well.
Remove everything extraneous, which is outside of the world of being. And Bataille is, no, we need more. I want excess. I want expenditure.
I think another important piece of context, although I suppose this might start to get us talking about the content of the book, which is probably good. There's John Maynard Keynes, who wrote The General Theory of Employment and Interest, or Interest and Employment.
Your favourite, so I hear.
My favourite economist of all time. Who himself was calling it the general theory, echoing Einstein's general theory of relativity. So these philosophers in the social science started using the idea of a general theory after Einstein published the general theory of relativity. And to me, it's always a red flag when I see anybody calling their theory the general theory, because they're clearly trying to associate. It's like Ethereum calling itself a proof of work blockchain back in the day. It's like, yeah, you're distributed in name only. So give me a break. You're a general theory of employment and interest in name only, not actually a status theory. And when I saw that Bataille started saying, oh, well, previously there was restricted theory of economics, now this is a general theory of economics, my alarm bells just started going off. I was like, uh-oh.
I was actually quite pleased because, that physics envy I find poisons a lot of basically just anything that's not physics.
Yeah.
It always sets off alarm bells when they're demonstrating clear physics envy. But with Bataille, it was good in that he very, very early on in the book, when he's framing what he's trying to do, he says you've got restricted economy, which is basically, so economy for him it's basically just allocation of energy, or where energy is in a system, which is not unreasonable. I think that's not a terrible way to look at it. And
that's
what he
actually
says
a really
is,
important part of economics.
Yeah.
Sure. Yeah. Which is actually probably pretty insightful given when he was writing. He's probably, because now modern theorists like Seyfedin Ammous actually has an entire chapter or two dedicated to energy in his third book, Principles of Economics. And there's Vaclav Smil. Is that how you pronounce the guy's name?
Václav Smil.
Yeah, he wrote this. He wrote a bunch of stuff on energy, and it has, I would argue, important economic implications. His stuff. So yeah, I'd say almost in a weird way, Bataille if he had stuck to just the energy discussion and not gone too weird, he could have made a really watershed contribution to economics, because he was probably ahead of the game with integrating economics and energy.
It was what you were saying earlier about just this fundamental distinction between how we approach books. Is I'm happy that he started off with something firm and used just to shoot off in a weird direction.
You're like, yeah, let's go.
I just like it when he'll make a few key assumptions and then go, okay, well, having assumed these things, let's see where this goes. It's almost like in mathematics how they'll just assume something that in day-to-day life, like everyone knows is just not the case, but they'll just assume it and go, okay, well, let's see what happens.
Yeah, it'll be like, let's assume the law of the excluded middle doesn't apply.
Yeah, doesn't apply. Let's see what happens. So I do like how he's got his general economy, he's got restricted economy, and he says restricted economy is really useful, and he doesn't do what a lot of people we've read do, where they come into a field and just say, okay, this is all shit, this is all stupid, I'm the only one who's right, everything else is bad. And
like Terrence Howard coming like a wrecking ball. He says
what restricted economy does is it's looking at very proximate human needs and solutions to needs. So something like employment. He says that restricted economy just looks at this problem of humans basically wanting resources and needing some way to get resources to then spend on things. And he says this is useful. It's not arbitrary that people do this. It's just restricted. What he says is that he's got this idea of general economy, which situates these proximate needs of humans in restricted economy within a broader context of flows of energy. And he says that basically every human action that is explained within restricted economy is just a part of this broader flow of energy across the earth and ultimately through the universe, just anywhere where there is energy. Human activity on the surface of planet Earth is just a small pocket. And a pocket of very weird energy dynamics, but ultimately just a pocket of broader energy movements across Earth. So the basic idea from which this entire general economy grows is he says that, all right, so you've got energy moving around, that's economy. Any phenomenon in existence is going to interact with energy. And then specifically, you've got living creatures. So we'll restrict it to humans for now, just to make it more concrete, and then we can generalize it from there. So he says at any one time, almost always, an organism has sufficient energy for its needs. And he defines sufficient energy really basically. It's basically just like, can the organism continue to function? So it's this basic energy is a lot lower than restricted economists would acknowledge. And he says anything above this he defines as wealth or excess. And what do you do with this wealth? So a portion of it can go towards growing the organism, so accumulating. It can go towards, say, making the organism bigger, or if an organism sexually reproduces, it can go towards reproduction. So in some ways, getting larger is getting larger in space. Reproduction is getting larger in time. You have descendants that will continue through time. But he says this is a saturable process. So you can hit a point at which you actually can't be putting more energy into a system. And that excess energy he calls the accursed share. Now, that energy needs to go somewhere. I guess he doesn't say it explicitly in this book, but I'm assuming that he had heard that energy can neither be created nor destroyed. And so when I was reading this, I had that in the back of my mind. It's okay. So he's thinking, you got this energy that you can't do anything with. An organism is keeping itself alive with a portion. It's growing with a portion. Anything above that, it can't get rid of this energy, so it has to do something with it. And Bataille says this energy you can accumulate for a while, but the more you're accumulating, the more this energy applies what he calls pressure. It's wanting to be expended. It's wanting to go somewhere else. And it can express itself in a number of wasteful activities, and we'll probably discuss what actually waste means in more detail once we get to the sort of criticisms of this book. But ways it can express itself can be things like art. It can be things like the sacred. So putting huge resources into building cathedrals, which, say, don't serve a clear utility purpose, like another type of building, I don't know, like a grain storage or a barn or a house. It can go into war, which for Bataille was probably the motivating reason ultimately behind writing this book, because he was afraid that the accumulation of resources, particularly in the United States and the Soviet Union at the time of writing, was going to lead to a war if they couldn't come up with a way to waste these resources or to bleed off this energy in a manner other than conflict. So, yeah, so that's the basic kernel of the idea which motivates this book, and from which basically everything else arises. We'll get more into, say, the sacred and the profane, but that all ultimately flows from his insight, I guess, about energy not being able to be created or destroyed and accumulating, and there being a point at which you can no longer absorb energy into a system. It needs to go somewhere.
Eventually burst or explode.
Yeah,
a system. And I guess so. From the book chapters itself, it then has the book chapters, or the major. There's like chapters and the major sections within those chapters. It's basically him taking this idea and applying it and trying to use it almost, would you say, anthropologically at times. So if I even just read out some of the book chapters, there's Sacrifice and Wars of the Aztecs, The Gift of Rivalry, Potlach, which is Native American ceremonies, like gift-giving ceremonies, or even just destroying things. I'm not entirely sure. The Conquering Society, Islam. The Unarmed Society, Lamaism, so that's Tibetan Buddhism. The Origins of Capitalism and the Reformation, and the Bourgeois World. He's essentially trying to explain these different historical and cultural phenomena within the framework that he's outlined in the first chapter of the book. And so, yeah, it is, I suppose, if you use the idea of reach from David Deutsch, he's saying this idea has immense reach. Let me apply it and show you where it applies. So one of there's a few other topics that we will explore, but we found that the core, or one of the most interesting applications, which Jack already hinted at with regards to the US versus the USSR, is applying this idea to capitalism and communism. Did you want to expand on that a bit, Jack?
I might go over a few other basic ideas first, and then we can go into, say, the development of capitalism, the bourgeoisie, the proletariat, and then how the Soviet Union and the United States are facing each other, and how, at least in Bataille's eyes, they might avoid kinetic war using the Marshall Plan, which I really enjoyed. But I just want to expand a bit on what I was saying earlier, because the description I gave of his theory earlier made it sound like this only really applies to organisms. And I think it's useful to begin by just talking about organisms, but because it's just more concrete and it's easier to see what he's saying. But it generalizes beyond organisms. So remember, this is general economy. He says this applies to everything where there is energy. So within the universe, like every object within the universe is subject to these same laws of accumulation and waste. And he says that the universe is gradually developing, I think he calls them more burdensome forms, these forms of greater and greater luxury, and which are ultimately greater and greater expressions of waste. So within the context of the universe, like an asteroid is not very complex. Like it's a rock. But on Earth, so you've got the sun, which is this ball, like this giant fusion reaction, which is just spitting out energy into the void around it. Like, it's not putting it towards any productive use. It's just wasting it.
It's the highest form of wealth. Pure energy.
Yeah. The sacred sun. And that waste is washing over the surface of the Earth. And on the surface of the Earth, you'll have plants, which are taking in this energy that's just cast off by the sun and incorporating it into themselves. But also, and so forming, like you said, more burdensome forms, more and more complex phenomena of energy transfer. And then those plants can be consumed by other organisms. So now we're getting into what the tiger is in space. So consuming other organisms is an act of immense waste. Because you think about what the consumption is ultimately of all of this energy accumulation by another organism is just now going to waste. It's just being obliterated and consumed. And he says it's intensely wasteful because this energy is around us anyway. Like, yeah, it's not in a form that is readily accessible, say, to a mammal. Like, we can't photosynthesize. We need to consume other organisms. But he sees it as, within the context of the universe, the fact that you'll have certain entities which can only get energy by destroying the energy accumulated by other organisms it's a universal expression of waste. From a restricted economic perspective, it's not wasteful. From a general economic perspective, it's intensely wasteful.
He often then you also get to the idea of like the perspective from the individual versus the perspective from the whole.
Yeah. The restricted and the general viewpoint, which we'll get to when we talk about capitalism and communism, which is not what you would immediately like. When I say that, it'll make it sound like, or people might expect that he was a Marxist. I think he was very influenced by Marx. I don't know if he considered himself...
It'd be hard to pin him as a Marxist from this book.
A Marxist. Yeah.
But, he's just doing his own thing.
Yeah. So, but how he looks at capitalism and communism from the perspective of restricted versus general economy is not what you would immediately expect, which I really enjoyed in this book. It was really surprising in a really fun way. But no, sex. That's the other thing. So consuming other organisms. He talks about the tiger as this ultimate symbol of waste because it's an apex predator. Not only is it eating plant, not only is it a plant that's just sucking up the waste of the sun, not only is it a herbivore, which is destroying things which are sucking up the waste of the sun, but it's an apex predator. It only subsists on the energy of other creatures which consume other creatures. It's just this apex of waste. That's what the tiger is in space. Just waste in space, which is I'm pretty sure it's a municipal waste album. They were probably writing re-thrash about George Bataille. So he talks about sex as well as another form of intense waste. So he says, okay, you got bacteria that they reproduce by binary fission. Like, they just split in two once they reach a certain size. And he says, okay, so here you've got immortality. So from this, he concludes that death is this almost an ultimate form of waste. Because from the perspective of, again, general economy, death doesn't have to happen because you've got organisms where it's not happening. You've got bacteria which just divide and don't die. They just keep dividing.
Yeah.
But you've got other organisms like humans which do die after a while. And again, he says...
instead of replicate.
He says like an individual human is intensely wasteful because it's just this incredible accumulation of resources that's then absolutely wasted in death.
Yeah.
And how do humans continue through this other intensely wasteful act of courtship, sex, gestation for 9 months, birth, having to raise this new organism, which is really tiny and, at least initially, like it probably needs a fourth trimester before it's on the level of other mammals when they're born. A human infant is just so helpless. All of this waste. And that's what the sexual act in time, he says. It's this act of waste in time to perpetuate the wasteful phenomenon of, say, you can say humans or just any animal that sexually reproduces. That's what the sexual act is in time, what the tiger is in space means. These are both two acts of intense waste, ultimately oriented towards death, which is itself the ultimate waste of biological organisms. It's just such a... Occupying this man's mind must have been so odd. I mean, this is why I like the book, because once you get this system in your head sufficiently, you can start looking at the world in this way. It's, I see that this constant cycle of energy and waste. But it's cool that the system generalizes beyond humans, beyond biological organisms, to just everything in the universe. It's very, very good.
It's an interesting way to look at the world. I suppose.
It's very fun. Yeah, I guess from then, probably the other big thing that's important to understand is when he talks about the sacred and the profane. These are concepts he unfolds more in the chapters on the Aztecs and American Indians, particularly with respect to the tradition of potlach, which was this almost aggressive competitive gift giving between chieftains to try to humiliate each other by giving each other bigger and bigger gifts of luxury items, so of items that didn't have a clear use. It was just showing off resources.
Yeah, it's like giving somebody, I don't know, a massive block of land or something on Animal Farm. not Animal Farm, sorry, Farmville.
Farmville.
Farmville, back in the day. Just, I'm just going to flex on my peers by just giving them some digital... Well, it's not even digital property, it's fake digital property. On Facebook. Why? Just to flex on them.
Yeah, it's like gifting someone a Bentley who doesn't even have a driver's license. So this is something you can't use. But, okay, so the sacred and the profane, these are really important ideas, and these are specific to humans. So the other things we've been talking about are kind of just universal things. The sacred and the profane, I'm pretty sure, just apply to humans. So what are they? It's the difference between waste or luxury and utility or accumulation. So what's the profane? The profane, these are, he calls them things. And what's a thing? A thing is something, it's an object which is basically made into a means to an end. It's given a use, it's given utility. And in doing so, what happens is the person who is giving it a use and giving it utility becomes, he calls it, subservient to this thing. Because now a person has something, I guess in some way they're even more tied to the world, and particularly for Bataille, tied to the future. And what accumulation of things and worrying more and more about usefulness does is it estranges you from yourself. And how does it do this? Okay, so for Bataille, he doesn't explicitly say this, but I'm kind of reading between the lines, and also from having read some of his works of fiction, and then whatever you call the solar anus, if you call it fiction or philosophy or just whatever the fuck it is. You are most you when you have no sense of obligation to the future. You're not withholding anything in the present.
Spontaneous.
Because you feel it is going to be required in the future, or it is going to benefit you in the future. You are intimate with yourself. That is, you know yourself interiorly rather than knowing yourself as a thing. And he says things are only known by their surface. You know yourself intimately and interiorly, or someone else intimately and interiorly, when they are extravagantly living, extravagantly using resources without any sense of obligation to the future. They have no subservience to the future. This is an assumption of Bataille's. This is the sort of thing that I read and think, okay, I'll just grant this for the purposes of reading this book, because I would consider actually your ability to defer pleasure. I'm showing my bourgeoisness in saying this. Your ability to defer pleasure is probably actually a component of you.
Yeah.
But yeah. So we'll just put what I would consider a very obvious criticism to the side, and just for the purposes of explaining his system of thought, say, okay, you are most yourself with no subservience to the future. Just bleeding off energy, just radiating off energy everywhere, engaging in whatever wasteful form of expenditure at that immediate moment captures your attention.
He must have been a lot of fun at parties, don't you reckon?
He was a fucking librarian.
Just a loose unit. But when he goes to a party, he just goes off. It's just shoving
he'll be
random things up
drunkenly
his
shitting himself and trying to fight everyone with an arm's reach.
And then hitting on
having knocked back
hitting it on every
25 tinnies of Carlton Draft. And his justification for it the next day is he was knowing himself intimately.
Whilst jacking off in the corner, like drunk, and throwing up all over himself.
I'm knowing
myself intimately at the party. Go back to the library, Georges.
Yeah. And okay, so that's the profane. Things become sacred when they're expended without any obligation to the future. It's pure expenditure. And I'll read a quote and then we can go into what it means, because I think understanding this energy cycle is fairly straightforward. Understanding what precisely he means by the sacred and intimacy took me a bit longer to clock. I'm like 70-80% sure I get what he means, but it's also conveying it is then difficult. So I quote, "Religion is the satisfaction that a society gives to the use of excess resources, or rather to their destruction, at least insofar as they are useful. This is what gives religions their rich material aspect, which only ceases to be conspicuous when an emaciated spiritual life withdraws from labour a time that could have been employed in producing. The only point in the absence of utility, the gratuitousness of these collective determinations. They do render a service, true, in that men attribute to these gratuitous activities consequences in the realm of supernatural efficacy, but they are useful on that plane precisely insofar as they are gratuitous, insofar as they are needless consumptions of resources first and foremost." So, from this, what I think he means when he's talking about the sacred as opposed to the profane is the sacred develops in human societies as a way to expend resources, as a way to get rid of this accursed share and maintain stability as opposed to explosiveness. Because he notes in a few parts of this book, people don't want to waste stuff. People actually want to keep things. Like, it's not that you get capitalism and suddenly people are now invested in keeping possessions. And before this point, people were just like setting their houses on fire because they were intuitively aware of the need to get rid of the accursed share. No, people always want to keep stuff. People always want to accumulate stuff, or at least not see it go up in smoke. What religion and the sacred are and what they do is they are ways that the accursed share can be conspicuously wasted and consumed, and avoiding instabilities like war. And what religion is it's basically a system ascribing to these wasteful acts supernatural efficacy. So say you build a huge cathedral. In terms of general economy, what's it actually doing? Well, it's sucking up the accursed share so that it's not going into things like social unrest or war. Instead, it's nice and safe in Notre Dame. What people see is they see, society is more stable the more we, quote unquote, worship, or the more sacred activities we take part in. And they'll ascribe to those activities basically some sort of protective function or some sort of utility. They say, okay, because we have venerated God with building this huge cathedral, God is making us more prosperous and giving us stability. That's what it's doing. So it's almost religion becomes this secondary explanatory function of what's really going on.
A thermodynamic explanation of the role of religion in human
religious
society.
impulse.
I love it.
So that's. I think that's what's going on here.
That's it's quite amazing, actually.
Yeah, I mean, look, I really enjoyed this book. If it weren't obvious,
I wouldn't necessarily call it respect, because I do also think that that's just an unbelievably frivolous thing to try to do.
Look, it's a leap. It's a big leap, and as much as affectionately as I regard this book, because I had so much fun reading it, I do have to acknowledge that it's a big leap of reasoning.
It's a jump for sure.
As much as I just want to agree with him because I really like what he's done there, I do have to check myself. So what we can talk about specific instances now, because I think, like, is there more to the basic framework of set out in this book that you want to go into? I should also actually note that this is volume 1 of 3. He's written 2 other books about the accursed share, which I've already ordered on the basis of having read this first one from Zone Books. Shout out to Zone Books. They make really nice editions. Wasteful. They didn't need to have really nice, thick, high-quality paper. They didn't need to have thick black paper on the interior of the front cover, but they did, and the book it's just so much more luxurious that way.
I guess
anyway, I'll
it's
stop
important
offering
to know
an Accursed Share interpretation of Zone Books' editions of the Accursed Share. Probably no one but me gives a shit about that.
No, it's given the nature of our podcast, you can assume that there are people in our audience that will actually like you said that, Jack. It's fine.
Is there more that you want to add to Bataille's general theory before we go into like specific cases that he cites?
I suppose there's one point, maybe I should have said this in the context or the problem situation part, but I guess from the point of view of other economists, I guess this is a book about economics, so he qualifies as an economist. Like, why not?
It's explicitly a book about economics.
Yeah, but I don't know. Most people wouldn't necessarily regard Bataille as an economist, but I would say that he is. It's a very strange one.
Yeah, insofar as he wrote a lot about economics. I think it's fair to consider him as an economist. He wrote
600 plus pages about it, right? I think the other book is like 400 pages. All the other economists, I sometimes frame my thinking in terms of what's the prevailing paradigm in a particular field. Is that prevailing paradigm correct or incorrect, or in what way is it incorrect? And also, what are the common misconceptions? And from his point of view, he's identified in the prevailing paradigm of both classical, post-classical, Marxist, and Austrian economics is that they've all looked at economics through the lens of scarcity as the driving factor of all economic relations, not waste. So he's literally inverted.
What do we do with all this energy?
He said, no, that's not what's causing all this. The scarcity isn't driving human action. Actually, the abundance and the accursed share is driving, as we have too much stuff. Which, I think, with that being said, now you understand the core.
Yeah. And so he does justify it by basically saying, okay, well, actually, the required amount of energy for, say, a biological system is just what keeps it functioning.
You can think of that as what's your base metabolic rate? Like, if you just eat just enough to keep your body the current weight it is, that's
and so for Bataille,
your basal,
anything above that
is waste, or luxury. Would you say luxury or surplus? Or
you'll have a portion of it which goes towards growing you, and so that energy still being used. But once you've exceeded how much you can grow, then it's accursed share, and it's got to go into luxury or war or sex or whatever. Oh, it's just a very different way of approaching economics. Yeah, you're right. Okay, what if the problem's not scarcity?
Yeah, it's literally the driving factor is actually the
getting rid of energy,
the lack of scarcity. I suppose scarcity to him is not necessarily a good thing, though. To him, would it just be having just enough to sustain your body or the ecosystem or the civilization is what we want? Because scarcity, we're going to starve, right, and die. Abundance, we're going to have a build-up of the accursed share and an explosion. So we just want to cruise at our basal metabolic rate for the civilization. Or if we go above, it's like getting in extra steps when you've had a cupcake or something in the morning. I'll do another. I'll take an extra circuitous route to work just to burn off that little bit extra.
Or I will cause World War III. Or I will explode and cause World War III. Because I guess for him, it's not. Yeah, I guess it's balance and stability. In that, the question is more, how do you expend this accursed share safely?
Yeah, are there social institutions, cultural norms, or whatever, or in some instances, religious rituals that quote unquote burn off that excess energy? Like it's almost like anthropological cardio for the civilization to stop the outbreak of violence. Can you do gift giving? All right, George Bataille walks into like the UN. All right, guys, we're gonna have a potlatch.
Let's talk about those things.
Netanyahu sit down with like, I don't know, whoever the leader of Hamas is, whichever of them is alive still. All right, stop. I've got an idea. We're gonna have a.
I've got an idea.
Whereas McKenna would be like, let's give him some shrooms. All these like crazy motherfuckers trying to figure out how to stop World War III. We just need something to work. Please.
Yeah, because he cites a few different civilizations in offering examples of how his idea of general economy works in different situations. He's got the Aztecs, who are really into human sacrifice, which, like, obviously that's a way to waste resources that could have been put towards utility.
It works. You're definitely expending energy.
It's expending a lot of energy.
You slaughtered 10,000 people at the top of a ziggurat. You are getting rid of
and
all
it is
that
interesting.
excess.
So he talks about how he talks about, say, the Aztecs and Islam during the time of Muhammad and very shortly afterwards as these two societies which used war to get rid of the accursed share, but they weren't conquest, or say the Aztecs weren't a conquest society because they weren't going to other lands to get land or to, say, take over land to put towards productive uses. They were going there to get people to sacrifice to the sun god, so the sun would
so insane
continue to exist.
Imagine living in that part of the world at that period.
Living next to them,
the absolute
really bad
fear.
neighbors.
Oh my god! You're just living in your village, trying to live a peaceful life, and killing the snakes that are trying to eat your babies and stuff, and then the Aztecs show up and take all of your men, sacrifice them. Fuck.
Yeah, and he talks about how, so in a military society, it's extremely regimented and aimed towards accumulation, so accumulation of land, accumulation of resources from the land. Whereas the Aztecs would just run into battle shirtless. A lot of the battle was quite ritualized, and the aim of it was to get resources that they would then expend. So to get people and slaves that they would then kill. It's interesting. He talks about Islam as this society where, so you had Bedouin tribes who were poetic, who were prone to violence within groups, and had all of these different ways to just burn off the accursed share. And he said what happened with Islam for a brief period is these forms of getting rid of the accursed share were subordinated to morality, and you had this huge expansion in terms of the lands subordinated to these tribes and spreading Islam, which was for a brief period accumulating resources. But he said that this morality ran out of steam and these old tribal ways reasserted themselves, and that accumulation petered out. He talks about potlatch as well as this, like you said, this gift giving where you would have rival chieftains would just give each other gifts of luxury items. So not items that could be dedicated to utility, but just pure expenditure.
I think sometimes they would even, correct me if I'm wrong, but I believe
wouldn't they
sometimes
just set it on fire.
Yeah,
sometimes?
they would actually just destroy things.
Yeah.
What's that whole deal of in some parts of the world? I don't know. India 50 years ago. I don't know if this is true. I'm just making stuff up. But apparently in some parts of the world, being overweight, especially as a man, was a sign of like wealth and status. You had enough food to actually eat, or like having more and more wives or whatever. It's almost that it's the frivolous disregard for the expense of the thing that you're doing. It's just, I'm going to destroy this thing. I'm just going to eat more food just to show that I have the resources to do it.
Yeah, and a few things are going on, say, with the potlatch, because Bataille says, okay, it might look like what they're doing is converting the accursed share, so these luxury items, into something which is still a thing, that is to say prestige and social position. So it's still a thing that you get utility from. So you demonstrate basically your power, your ability to expend by gathering together lots of useful things and just setting it on fire or just giving it to your enemy. But I think what he's saying is that's sort of a rationalization, a religious rationalization of what's really happening. So the reason why potlatch was efficacious in maintaining social stability was just the brute fact of destroying the Accursed Share. The fact that you're just getting all of these resources and destroying them. That's what actually was causing society to remain stable. The fact that you are, quote-unquote, converting these luxury items into something which has utility, that is to say social position, is not really what's going on. Or that is what's going on, but it's not what's causing society to be stable.
He is almost forming a bridge into the abstract realm of virtue ethics through thermodynamics.
From the thermodynamics of virtue ethics.
Explanation of, because often what he's saying is this is helping, like he's taking a moral position. He's saying this helped prevent war, and war is bad, right? This is the problem. This is one of the problems he's trying to solve. So if we don't do that, we risk World War III. So we need to have something like, we need to have, for example, the United States throwing off all this profit they should give to India or whatever. And otherwise there's going to be a build-up. But if there's going to be a build-up, why should that result, like saying that it's going to result in war is and it's this weird kind of, okay, well, this explosion of thermodynamic energy, it's going to be kinetic, and it's going to be kinetic energy or thermonuclear energy, and it's going to be used for destructive purposes. Why couldn't it just be, okay, let's just shoot some nukes up into space and just let them off? You know?
I reckon. So before recording, Levi and I were talking about this, of like, okay, well, why couldn't the US get rid of its Accursed Share by just generating heat from friction energy? But I think for Bataille, he would say
that's what NASCAR is actually doing. The role of NASCAR is just to generate a bunch of latent heat.
Existence. NASCAR is preserving global stability. I'm pretty sure he would say, like, yeah, that's good. That's a sacred act, which is drawing down on the Accursed Share and reducing the possibility.
That's also the ontological role of ephedrine and clenbuterol and Ozempic. It's just
bodybuilding,
burn off tons of excess fat to create peaceful civilization to avoid World War III. So there we go. Clen is causing world peace.
Clen and Tren. Yeah.
I thought it was just to get buff, but it's actually to preserve world peace.
Well, there's actually a deeper meaning, a deeper general meaning to the waste of bodybuilding.
Yeah.
Ronnie Coleman,
the sexual act in time,
agent of world peace.
The sexual act in time is what what Ronnie Coleman is in space.
Ronnie Coleman is in space. The more space Ronnie Coleman takes up, the more peaceful the Earth is.
There was a distinct lack of war during peak Ronnie Coleman time.
During Officer Coleman's time.
Yeah, sorry. What is a 5-time world Mr. Olympia?
No, didn't he win like 8?
Some absurd number of times.
Police
officer Ronnie Coleman preserving world peace. That man deserves a Nobel Peace Prize for taking up so much space and using up so much excess energy of the civilization that he has delayed or perhaps prevented World War III. Who's going to take his place? Who can possibly take that man's place?
Why do you think the world is more and more unstable?
Ever since Coleman retired.
Ronnie Coleman retired.
The world's been getting more unstable.
This is a good way to get onto the problem of capitalism. Because
we will parlay this back into a conversation about the book.
This is part of another reason why I like this book is I was sort of expecting a traditional Marxist critique of capitalism.
Yeah, we didn't get that.
Which I've heard before.
His
critique of capitalism is, there's a critique. It's just really fucking weird and really unexpected and really fun. So a bit on the rise of capitalism. So the Catholic Church in medieval Europe was a fairly stable entity, but it had some problems. And okay, how was it an age of stability?
It had some problems, did it, Jack?
Had some problems. But when I say it had some problems, the Bataille problems are very different from the problems that you would think otherwise. So how was it maintaining stability is an important thing. So the Catholics had this idea, or still have this idea, that works on earth can get you into heaven. And this is something that Protestants deny.
And Calvinists strongly deny.
Calvinists don't quite agree with this. Shout out to Trent.
Shout out.
And so what the Catholics were doing is basically you could pay the church and they would put that money towards things like cathedrals or nice clothes for bishops, all of these forms of luxury. So in Bataille's general economy, forms of luxury, forms of conspicuous expenditure that were burning off the accursed share.
Yeah.
And preventing accumulation of wealth, this explosive force. And so that was keeping some stability. A big problem was this was making the sacred profane. And how was it doing this? So remember, the profane is something with a utilitarian use case.
You can think almost like secular as well. There's this, okay, we're going to look at the world through economic development. It's utilitarian, it's secular. It's
and the sacred, so God, was being made profane, or at least being tainted with it, because these resources that people would give to get into heaven were, sure, they were being put towards sacred objects like cathedrals, but there was a big element of the profane, a big element of utility to them, because, okay, why are you giving them? Well, I want to go to heaven. That sounds like real utility. It sounds like a really good investment. That sounds
like a means to an end. It sounds like also an investment in the future, and a really long future, actually.
Yeah. It sounds like servility to the future.
Preventing you from being your true self in the now.
Yeah. Just being this singularity of consumption. The ideal man. And so what happened with Luther, and then particularly with Calvin, is Luther came around and said, basically, works won't get you into heaven. So what you do on earth is profane. He split the sacred and the profane. So God exists completely independently of what you do on earth. What you do on earth is not going to influence God. Basically, like, you're going to go to heaven or you're not. And your works on earth don't influence that. So Bataille says in doing so, Luther saved the sacred, or saved God as being sacred, because you no longer had people profaning God by destroying the accursed share to try to get some sort of divine favor. But in the development of capitalism, Calvin was even more important, because Luther opposed plenty of things like usury, whereas Calvin didn't really have a problem with that, or said it was fine, said like, yeah, you should make money off good investments, or should be able to.
Common sense investing and strategic marketing.
Yeah, exactly. It was written by Calvin. It was one of his key works. Rich Dad, Poor Dad was what really got Calvin's name out.
John Calvin. Rich Dad, Poor Dad by John Calvin.
Yeah.
So dumb. I'm sorry.
It's been handed down through the ages. Rich Dad, Poor Dad by John Calvin.
Sorry, go on.
And so what this process of splitting really decisively splitting the secular world, or the profane world and the sacred world, does is, at least initially, it allows people to engage more fully in accumulating in the profane world because they're no longer giving otherwise useful objects over to be wasted for the sacred, because there's now this idea of, well, your works on earth don't get you any closer to heaven, so you may as well accumulate them. And Bataille notes that this unchaining of productive forces has been resisted by every sacred group in society up till now. What happens with Protestantism is, under the cover of very, very morally righteous men, so men whose morality was unimpeachable, people like Calvin or Luther, productive forces started to be unchained. And for him, productive forces have their own internal logic. And when I was reading this, I could really see why Nick Land was so influenced by Bataille. He's got this idea that productive forces have their own logic, will start just running away with themselves and accumulating more and more and more and generating more and more and more, but are constrained by human sense of the sacred. That is, some tacit acknowledgement on behalf of humans that they need to expend the accursed share to maintain social stability. But Protestantism and finally Calvinism started to rip away those safeguards. And eventually you hit the bourgeois world. And in the bourgeois world, God has been basically forgotten. So, still in the time of Luther and Calvin, God was close enough that even though there was this hard separation between the profane and the sacred worlds, people still believed in God. And God was this organizing principle of people. But you leave it long enough, if God is distant for long enough, people just start forgetting about God and live purely within the material world. And within this material world, the bourgeoisie just surrender themselves to material forces. He says a really distinctive feature of the bourgeoisie is that they're completely fatalistic with respect to productive forces. They just give themselves over to them entirely. The bourgeoisie see themselves as things, just as these things which are acted upon by productive forces, which are leaving the control of humans. And a really, really important thing for Bataille's problem situation of how to stop World War III is that accumulation is now happening at an exponential rate. So you've taken away the sacred, it expresses itself in many different forms depending on the religion, but this way of getting rid of the accursed share, and instead you have more and more resources being reinvested in a system to make the system more productive of more resources, which are then reinvested into the system to make it more productive of more resources. And that's good because, I mean, I guess in some ways the system is able to absorb more resources, but it's generating a greater accursed share per unit time than it can absorb. So while the productive capacity is increasing exponentially, the accursed share is also increasing exponentially in capitalism.
Yeah, there's no shock absorber.
And because we've ripped away these safeguards of the sacred, these control
so essentially
in
what
this
they
fissile
are
reaction.
They are a societal heat sink, essentially.
Yeah.
Yeah. And now we don't have the sacred to act as a heat sink.
Yeah.
And so all that is now going to be, what would you say? It's when you
it's explosive.
Put too much energy into the grid and you fry the grid, right? And short circuit everything and put too much in. We don't have a shock absorber for the system. Now that we killed God. No more shock absorber for the accursed share. So we're going to have World War III.
And you think back to what we said earlier about pressure.
Weirdly following this logic. This is so strange.
How energy wants to... I guess you can always think of it like entropic gradients. Like energy wants to go along an entropic gradient and equalize that gradient. And as you accumulate more and more and more, Bataille says the two world wars were the greatest orgies of expenditure in human history.
Yeah.
So you had
type of orgy, I suppose.
You had the capitalist world, which is this system of unleashing productive forces. It's not complete. It's not perfect, but it does produce an exponentially larger accursed share. And he said the two world wars are evidence of this and evidence of how dangerous this process is to leave unchecked. Because I guess you think about this guy's life, like the two world wars were just when the world, particularly Europe, went insane and obliterated itself.
He did see a lot of excess kinetic energy unleashed upon
a lot of
the landscape
energy.
And the cities of Europe. like the conquest of Paris. I think there was a lot of kinetic energy released there. Drew.
Yeah, and that's his problem with capitalism, which it's not a traditional Marxist critique of capitalism. This is the latent energy generated by this, which needs to express itself somehow, is too great. And if we don't work out a way to expend it in a safe manner, it's going to turn into a war.
Weirdly, it makes sense because of Nazism. Do people consider the Nazis a secular regime? Or is that a misunderstanding of mine? They had this kind of... Because they wanted the church to be subsidiary to the state, right? Just like Benito Mussolini. And so I would consider that secular in a weird way.
I'd see it as secular in that it was effectively state worship.
Yes, state worship. So it's a transformation of the sacred into the state and channeling that excess production and excess energy below the accursed share. They channeled it into war, and so did communist Russia. And I suppose eventually, so did the US as well. Or so does the US.
Yeah. So this is, I guess, then the other problem within capitalism, and I guess this is related ride. To the accursed share, is this idea of losing intimacy with oneself. So earlier we talked about intimacy versus things. A thing is something with a use case that you know by its exterior. So just, okay, by its exterior, I think he just means, like in a superficial sense, okay, what is this thing? What are its obvious inputs and outputs? How do I put this towards a productive end to accumulate or to generate more wealth? And a thing that is known intimately is a thing that is wasteful and that is not servile to material circumstances or the future. It is itself in a sovereign manner, which, like, for a person, for Bataille, again, is the person pissing and shitting himself, masturbating in the corner drunkenly at a party, who's not servile to any sense of the future. He's just a singularity of infantile impulses radiating outwards in a solar manner.
It truly is the solar anus. Jimmy's drunk again in the whacking off in the corner.
Jimmy's being intimate and sacred again. This is why we don't invite him out anymore. It's the overwhelming sacredness of Jimmy.
It was funny when we were in undergrad. Just getting old.
It's just...
You don't want to be the 40-year-old at a college party whacking off in a corner, throwing up on yourself.
But under capitalism, because we give ourselves over completely to the material world, we're completely servile to the future and to productive forces, we lose intimacy with ourselves. And Bataille, again, this is just an assumption on his part, he just says every human has this desire to be intimate with themselves, to be in a sovereign manner. And he says that the bourgeois, feeling this, they try to find the sacred or the intimate, and they always seek it in an external object, but in doing so destroy that object's sacredness. They make it profane because they're grasping for it in a utilitarian way. They're grasping for this object of the sacred.
Get something out of it.
And asking of it, make me intimate with myself. And they're making a thing of it in doing so by trying to subject it to, or subjecting it to, utility, which is antithetical to the sacred.
Yeah.
So the bourgeois have this tendency to just continue destroying everything sacred in searching for the sacred. So the bourgeois capitalism is this corrosive force that obliterates any sacredness in the world.
I can't tell you how many of my social network would deeply agree with that. As they live bourgeois lives.
Deeply agree with it, but I imagine for different reasons.
Metropolitan areas, yeah, exactly. Yeah, that's true. Okay, but let me tell you.
This book's so fun.
Yeah.
Because he says a lot of things that I've heard from kind of shit libs, but it's just the reasoning behind it is just so alien to at least that world.
It's a very strange roundabout way to shit on capitalism.
Yeah. He does like aspects of it because he says a big problem is how do you move beyond capitalism without also obliterating all of the material benefits of capitalism. So he's not saying, okay, yeah, just bomb it to the ground or something. He tries to work out a way out, and the way out basically involves how do you reintroduce wasteful expenditure or conscious wasteful expenditure? Because I guess his problem is with unconscious wasteful expenditure that comes with not understanding general economy. And the fact that this oftentimes leads to war, or even if it doesn't often lead to war, just the fact of if you have enough explosive material, if you have enough accumulation, which capitalism does really well, it accumulates really well, even if there's a small chance of war, when the war does occur, it's cataclysmic because so much energy has been built up. He talks about Soviet communism, and again, like he defends Bolshevism, but it's not in your typical tanky way. It's again it's in a really odd way. So he says Bolshevism's good because it tries to re-sacralize man by completely getting rid of any sense of, I guess, the religious. He says that, and I might be misunderstanding him, but I think this is what he's saying about Marx's project, which was then being implemented in the Soviet Union, where Marx was trying in some roundabout way to make man sovereign again or intimate with himself again by completely unconstraining productive forces. And once productive forces are completely unconstrained, they follow their own logic and in some sense don't need people anymore. So people might work on them, but they're simply following the logic, the absolute logic of productive forces. And this in some way frees people from being subservient to the future of these productive forces, because these productive forces will function without people. And in doing so, people are finally made sovereign again. I'm not sure if I interpreted that correctly or not, because it just doesn't make sense to me, but I think that's what he was saying about the Marxist project and why it could be valuable. This brings us around to talking about the Cold War, which is interesting, because he talks about how the Cold War and global workers' movements, their real benefit might be the pressure they apply to American capitalism to make American capitalism expend its gigantic accursed share in a way that won't lead to war, which is interesting.
Yeah.
And he says this happens through a few different vectors. One is global workers' movements putting pressure upon capitalist industry to pay workers more, give them better benefits, make them work fewer hours, give them weekends, give them more holidays, these sorts of things. What are these demands? Ultimately, they're ways that expend the accursed share that would be accumulated by capitalists, but instead they're being expended on workers who will then, I don't know, spend them on just anything. Like it's something wasteful, some sort of luxury. That's one way. The Soviet Union also contributes to what Bataille calls dynamic peace. He says that the nuclear arsenals of the Soviet Union and the United States represent these huge, like, heat sinks, I guess. Like, you get rid of God as a heat sink. Now you've got a nuclear arsenal that you can just pour resources into. And that's instead of shooting each other and expending resources in that way.
Yeah,
the Soviet Union and
the military-industrial complex becomes the heat sink.
The military-industrial complex is
society.
saving us. Yeah. And then, finally, he says that the other way that the Soviet Union might actually be contributing to peace is by putting pressure on the American economy to become more state-centric. And when it becomes more state-centric, it becomes less of restricted economy. And he saw capitalism as of restricted economy because it's a bunch of people making individual decisions to try to maximize their own productive gain. Whereas you need to step outside of that because that just leads to accumulation. You need to step outside of that and have a more general approach, which a government can do, where things are wasted as well. Like it's just justifying, like a massive government bureaucracy is also a heat sink. Like it is just sucking up resource. Like it's taking people's taxpayer money and pissing it up the wall.
Yeah, paying your paying your rates to your local government. This is a
creative way of defending high taxation.
Your local
this is a way I haven't come across before.
Paying your rates, your council rates, or your taxes to your local municipal government is actually your way of burning off the accursed share to prevent World War III. So we have actually come up with a good justification for paying your bloody taxes. I'm paying my tithings to the universe to prevent World War III.
It was funny reading this section. So this was published in 1949. And initially when I read the section on the Soviet Union, and he was saying, yeah, look, the Soviet Union is just going to outcompete the capitalist world. It's going to destroy it. Initially I thought, with 2024 hindsight, this part's just kind of like it's an interesting historical artifact, but the Soviet Union did fall apart and the US empire still exists. But then the more I thought about it, the more I realized he probably actually was getting more right than I initially gave him credit for, because he said that ultimately the influence of the Soviet Union is going to be in pushing the US government to take over control of more of the economy.
Which it did.
And in doing so, waste more of the accursed share.
I guess it goes through waves, doesn't it?
And the US government is a lot bigger and a lot more wasteful than it used to be.
Yeah.
Like its capacity to waste wealth is world class. It doesn't really have many competitors in that regard. So I guess he sort of he got to a sort of right answer in a funny way. So I guess I'll give him partial credit for that.
Yeah. It's a weird way to come at it. But
that's this entire book, though. Yeah. This entire book is a very weird way to come at economics.
Anyways, if we look through our things on our list to talk about, do you feel as though we've covered these three sufficiently?
Yeah, I reckon.
Okay, so there's. Do you want to go and move on? We sort of mentioned the Aztecs and the potlach. Do you want to talk about... I'd like to talk about a couple of criticisms before we wrap, and then maybe maybe one or two modern applications. So...
Yeah. Oh, actually, I just remembered the Marshall Plan. This is the final way that war is prevented. Because so the Marshall Plan, I'm not a historian. It was basically I think it only lasted for a few years, but it was basically
dollars to Western Europe,
the United States,
US,
funding the reconstruction of Western Europe in large part so that they could build up an export market for US products. and I think a lot of the funds
take their gold
put into Western Europe were then spent on American exports. It was also a way to get Europe subservient to the United States, and Europe is still an imperial outpost of the United States.
The United States,
so
Fort Knox still has all of your gold. The United States has like all this French gold they just refuse to give back to France. Like, you can have US dollars instead. They, no, we don't. What's your dollars? Give us our gold back. The Yanks like, no, we will keep your gold. It's almost as if the Yanks know that the gold has more value than the dollar. Anyways, I'm getting off track.
Anyway. Yeah, so that's he talks about the Marshall Plan a lot. That's basically why he finds the Marshall Plan interesting, because he saw it as
a way of throwing off excess energy.
Gift giving, almost an international potlatch.
Yeah. I really like the idea of analysing geopolitics through the lens of potlatch and needing a civilizational energy sink for the Accursed Share. For some reason, I really like this idea. There's something about it that speaks to me. I was previously strongly against the 2% target for Australia and other countries. For anybody who doesn't know, the 2% target is this idea that you have 2% of your GDP or your government income going towards foreign aid, pretty much. Before this episode, strongly against it. Fuck the 2% target. Now, make it 10%.
I only oppose how it's implemented. I think
it should just
the better way to implement it would be just to ship luxury items to impoverished parts of the world. And by luxury items, I mean items with no utility.
Zero utility.
Just send like a bunch of paintings to an Indian slum. Like, no, we're not giving you food.
Or
this, you've got to bear in mind, this only exists to wind down the Accursed Share. Or just send them food and set it on fire in front of them.
Ferrari Enzo or something, but to a place
send them Ferraris
with no road or infrastructure.
Just buys tons of Ferraris. 100%. Of our international aid is Ferraris.
And we're sending it to, I don't know, Republic of Congo or something.
Papua New Guinea.
The middle of Papua New Guinea.
Ferraris into the Papua New Guinea.
They're up there eating their brains in the middle of some valley in Papua New Guinea. Fucking Ferrari.
Just a Ferrari.
Just airdropped in by some Australian chopper. Thanks for helping us prevent World War III.
Shout out to the PNG tribes people for helping us prevent World War III by absorbing our Ferraris. All the Ferraris that would have gone into war are instead being wastefully consumed by people in Papua New Guinea.
Wonder what they would even do with it.
Big shout out to them.
You know, it would be fantastic if the tribes between the different valleys in Papua New Guinea then start to burn off their Accursed Share, starts trading the Ferraris. We have more waste Ferraris.
Make a Ferrari economy.
Set their waste Ferraris on fire right in front of each other.
That would be so stabilizing.
One of the chieftains is just in the corner whacking off. Burning off his Accursed Share.
He's realised his own self-intimacy through an excess of Ferraris.
All right,
we really need a party in Australian politics that is explicitly based around the times.
Yeah, we've got one. We've got one, boy. Crypto nukes Queensland, baby. Crypto nukes Queensland. It's now crypto nukes and Ferraris.
Yes. So we've now worked out a third source of expenditure for crypto nukes Australia. Also, okay. So the problem is because
our problem situation
Bitcoin.
is.
The problem situation is we're going to need to give a lot away because Bitcoin accumulates.
Wrong.
And like the whole point of it. Oh, wrong.
In fact, this is why yet another reason why Satoshi is a genius, because he realized he
understood Bataille and general economy.
He understood Bataille and Nick Land. He realized not only is there an inevitable exponentiation of techno-capitalism into post-human transcendence, but there is also a build-up of excessive accursed share energy, and we need a heat sink for the civilization, not to help the world, but because World War III could threaten the ascendancy of the techno-capitalist intelligence. So, therefore, he came up with a computer system into which we can pour infinite amounts of energy, and we never get any more money. It's nothing but a pure heat sink for the internet and our energy.
Yeah.
we can burn all the energy,
and especially
in the entire world.
Once you hit the 21 million
and we
Bitcoin existing, it is just a pure
heat sink. Bitcoin is actually just a heat sink to solve the accursed share problem.
The Bitcoin network is God. The Bitcoin network is the new sacred.
We're going to sacralize. We're going to move. We're going to refocus our religious instinct away from the state, and we're going to focus it on the network and the Bitcoin network.
I think we need to reconceptualize Bitcoin as actually, instead of being a network of exchange, it's actually the new sacred.
No,
that's its primary function.
we could have Bitcoin network.
Secondary functionality is monetary. The primary functionality is sacred.
But we should start having digital potlatches with Bitcoin, where we just like have a party and then we show
where you forget your keys.
You just transfer it to a dead wallet.
You hit yourself in the head with a hammer, so you forget your keys. and lose your
we can literally burn the coins and you can hit yourself in the head with you want just before whacking off in the corner. We should give the tribes people in Papua New Guinea some Bitcoin. We can give them Bitcoin to Bitcoin. Like
just
to like an invalid address or something.
Yeah, just send them a bunch of Trezor hardware wallets. Nothing to plug them into.
No context.
Just load them up with Bitcoin and drop them from an airplane.
We could spend 2% of our GDP on buying Bitcoin, putting it into a wallet, then just dropping it in a Ferrari into the middle of Papua New Guinea.
Into the PNG Highlands.
Oh, shout out to PNG.
You have to avoid Port Moresby, where they might have a way of using it.
The Ferrari or the Bitcoin.
And putting it towards some sort of utility. It has to be into the Highlands.
Far out.
And specifically into places with no access to electricity.
Yeah. Preferably somewhere where they don't speak English, which I think is most of PNG.
Yeah.
So that shouldn't be too hard.
Yeah.
So...
Yeah, I think this is a good idea, and I'm going to be writing to my local MP as soon as we stop recording. I've got a really good idea.
Dear Minister Smith, I now have a suggestion for our foreign policy. I have been reading... Anyway, so modern applications of the ideas in this book, Bitcoin was the main one that we came up with, and we've just demonstrated that the best is still the best.
Yeah.
Quick criticisms before we wrap up the episode.
Mm-hmm.
My main one was just reductionism. Really, it's just let's just reduce all of human dynamics into energetics. I think the main thing is like, why does the like, why can't we just be saved? Why can't it just be excess energy just be saved indefinitely, or whatever? So like, why does it have to have this like bubbling over effect? And I don't know how to put this, but there's this like, there's almost like there's a gap between, okay, well, there's this excess energy, but how does that leap over into the world of human action? Like, what's the causal mechanism? It's almost like it's almost a metaphysical assertion. It's like, well, there is this excess energy, and so therefore something has to happen, and any human action that can be regarded as quote unquote wasteful in whatever way you conceptualize wastefulness is reducible to burning off that excess energy. I don't know. It's just, there feels like there's a gap there somewhere. I'm not quite sure how to pinpoint it. I don't know if you have any way of pinpointing.
How would Bataille resolve? Yeah, because he just asserts this idea of pressure.
Yeah.
Okay, so you've got like just any energetic
why
thing
is it coming
exerts
through
pressure
instead of just
So I guess
stuff breaking down physically.
Like, this is a leap. He doesn't say this in the book. So I guess in the same way that I just kind of assumed that he had read about or heard of the energy cannot be created nor can it be destroyed.
Yeah, I think that's what it is.
He might have also been thinking of like entropic gradients.
Yeah.
I don't. When was the second law of thermodynamics posited? Probably before this book was written.
Probably.
But it might be on the basis of that. So like, yeah, the greater a concentration of energy in some space, whether it be physical or metaphysical, it's going to exert pressure because it's going to try to equalize itself with respect to the energy around it. So maybe it's that. Maybe that's where the idea of pressure comes from. But that's a reach. He doesn't say it in this book. He just says pressure exists.
Yeah. There's a few leaps of logic there that would be nice if he filled in. Maybe he fills them in the second part.
There are a fair few. Yeah.
The second part looks wild.
In terms of situating human action,
look wild.
I think
we should maybe consider doing them.
Yeah. The second one is just on the erotic.
Yeah.
Because he's French. He just has to do it. With situating human action in this, I think what he's saying is these general economic dynamics exist universe-wide, and human action is just this little, like, quite interesting subset of it, but it exists within the context of all of these energetic movements. And all human action is ultimately actually an expression of these movements of general economy. I think that's what he's saying. Like, when we talk about restricted economy, which is just human action, we're looking at proximate problems, proximate causes of those problems, and proximate solutions to those problems. It's very restricted, and it's just this little subset of broader energetic flows. I think that's what he'd say.
Yeah. So my second criticism, I suppose, I don't know if it is really a criticism. Is it a criticism? Popper said this really interesting, made this interesting point when he was, I think it was in the Logic of Scientific Discovery, where he was criticizing Marx, and it must have been in a different book. He was criticizing Marx, but he was criticizing Marx, Freudian psychoanalysis, and Adlerian psychoanalysis. And his main criticism can be summarized as, if the theory explains everything, it doesn't explain anything. Which is to say, you can use Freudian analysis, the idea of complexes or whatever, to explain any human phenomena. It's like, okay, essentially it's infinitely adaptable. And or in the words of David Deutsch, it's easily varied. And because it has this easy ability to vary it ad hoc to explain any phenomenon, it's not actually serving any purpose. It's completely extraneous, and so whenever I see a theory that is a kind of universal theory, this that it spreads across all fields, and it just explains everything. That I think it's very reasonable to assert that there's theories and ideas that apply to, obviously the world is unified, so there's things that apply. All of the different theories that we have of different parts of the world, economics, physics, and so forth, they have to not contradict one another, but they can also be understood autonomously. They are their own complex and autonomous domains of the world. And so you can study, for example, physics independently of studying economics, and you can have, if not a complete understanding, at least a sort of quasi or autonomous understanding without reducing one to the other. In this case, reducing economics to physics, even though being a physical system, all economic systems must be constrained. They can't, there's no economic system that breaks the laws of physics. But to just reduce all economics to physics is a mistake. You're obliterating that autonomous understanding of that phenomena. And to some degree, the reason why we have some distinctions between fields seem to be more like a consequence of just needing to have university departments or something. But in some instances, it seems as though there's a reasonable line to draw, because it is actually possible to understand one field autonomously of another. For example, you can...
It's almost like a level of abstraction.
Yeah, you can understand, say, genetics independently of quantum physics, even though obviously being physical objects, DNA and so forth, obey the laws of quantum physics. But no biologist needs to know about the laws of quantum physics in order to do their genetics or their zoology or whatever. So in this instance, it just strikes me as reductionism, and it's reductionism to an easily varied explanation that purports to explain everything but doesn't really explain anything, because you can just say any particular human phenomena is us burning off excess energy, excess accursed share. And it's like, okay, well, if that's what everything's doing, then what information does that give me about when I actually want to understand a specific phenomena? It doesn't give me anything extra.
I think of this work as a number of other works we've done on this podcast that I've enjoyed. I'm not sure if Bataille intended it this way, but more as an artistic endeavor, in that it allows for different perspectives on everyday phenomena or everyday objects, which are interesting and beautiful. And part of the beauty of it is actually that adaptability that makes it, as a scientific theory, easily varied, and I think as a result less useful and less descriptive. But the ability to transfigure experience into new forms is a feature of art, and something that this book does wonderfully well. And the feature of this book that I really enjoy and find very beautiful. So I see it more as an artistic work, and I think it very much succeeds on those terms.
Do you think that he meant it as
a work of science?
Do you think he meant it artistically or scientifically?
Probably, maybe in some ways both.
Yeah.
So he was obviously very artistically sensitive, but he wrote this book as a work of economics. Said explicitly that it was a work of economics, and I think our framing of his problem situation of how do I stop World War III as being a reasonable framing, and it's it's a very concrete problem. He was trying to solve a concrete problem.
Yeah.
So I suspect he probably meant it more scientifically and descriptively rather than as a means of transfiguring experience.
Yeah.
Which is where I think the book succeeds the most. I think it really succeeds as a way of transfiguring the reader's experience in an artistic sense.
Yeah, interesting. So, yeah, it is important to note.
And that's where I find by far the most value.
His problem, which is reasonable. I think that's perfectly reasonable. So his problem situation is preventing World War III.
It's totally different.
And he literally says in the opening introduction, this he essentially says this book is essentially a Copernican revolution in economics, which is a pretty
yeah. I love it when people say that. I've read that so many times.
Pretty big call. If you're writing that,
we've had so many Copernican revolutions.
You better be bringing your A game if you're gonna.
You better bring your A game
if you're gonna say that. But that brings us to our final couple of questions as we wrap. Do you think he succeeded in solving his problem situation?
Well, let me ask you this, Levi. Have we had World War III?
Oh, got me, bitch.
I am confident in assigning a single cause to why we haven't had World War III. And I think it was the publication in 1949 of The Accursed Share by Georges Bataille.
And it's seeping out into the culture and then affecting the decision makers who control the means of production. They're channeling more of the civilization's energy into Ferraris and Bitcoin miners. And military.
First, during the Cold War, it was into nuclear weapons, but now it's Bitcoin mining and Lamborghinis,
ASIC chips, and so forth. So yeah, there you go. He solved it.
Actually, when we were talking about earlier, like, why can't the Accursed Share just be radiated off as heat? Well, isn't that what ASIC chips do?
It's like, literally, yeah. It is.
The primary function of an ASIC chip is to generate heat. The secondary function
is to secure the network.
is to just do lots of hashes.
Yeah, it's really
the most important thing they're doing is making heat.
One person might think that securing the network is a bug, but it is a feature, but it's in fact a bug. It's a side effect of the primary purpose, which
side
is
effect of making heat.
Generate latent heat. That's the main reason. Satoshi was strongly inspired by Georges Bataille. In fact, I would say, reading the white paper, you might think, he's trying to solve the strict supply of the monetary medium and the third party problem on transactions, but that wasn't. That's only reading at layer 1 of the Satoshi white paper. But really, if you read between the lines, you can see what he's really trying to do is he's trying to compel people to just burn off huge amounts of latent energy.
It's a new religion and a new sacred. What's the sacred? What your religion is? It's a story told to justify the conspicuous expenditure of the sacred. That is the Bitcoin white paper.
That's the Bitcoin network.
In fact, I would go so far as to posit that we don't know who Satoshi was or is.
It was probably Bataille.
Georges Bataille probably faked his death.
Satoshi faked was his Georges death. Bataille.
Got really into cryptography and wrote
Studied
the Bitcoin
cryptography
white paper.
and monetary theory for 4 decades, and then wrote the Bitcoin white paper before dying in 2011.
And prevented World War III first with the Accursed Share and then with the Bitcoin white paper. So, did he solve his problem situation? Absolutely.
Undoubtedly, irrefutably. Thank God for Georges Bataille.
Would we recommend this book? Would we recommend this book? Yeah, like I've already said a few times, I really recommend it. I think it's
actually readable. Which
at worst,
it's fine. Which is
really
nice.
Fun.
It's really weird. It's also from if you're a little capitalist piggy like me and Jack, oink oink. It kind of gets boring to read Marxist criticisms of, in my opinion. I don't want to speak for you, Jack, but it gets really boring to read Marxist or kind of Marxist adjacent criticism. It was really nice to read one that was just completely out of left field.
Because I was expecting the traditional Marxist criticism, but. So it was just a wild ride, realizing that his criticism of capitalism was very new. I had not come across it before.
Strikingly original. Strikingly original. It gets points for originality. Okay, and what's our wrap question? Is it shout outs? Oh yeah, any shout outs? Shout outs. Hey, we just did our episode 100 patron hangout last Wednesday. So this is episodes coming out. what do you reckon, Jack? We have about a 6-week delay, I would say, something like that.
Something like that.
We recently, last week, we dropped episode 100, and then we had Hangout with Discord. It was mostly patrons, but a couple of non-patrons came, which was really nice to speak to some other people who aren't patrons yet, although maybe one day. And it was a great time. I got drunk and then told Jack to...
And started becoming intimate with yourself on camera.
Started
became sacred.
Using it as an opportunity to burn off the Accursed Share in these nuts on stream. No. And so I guess I just wanted to give a shout out to everybody who came to that hangout. That was really cool. I reckon, probably 8 or 10 people came, something like that. Maybe 8 plus ourselves over the course of the entire time. And it was really fun. I know, it was really nice recap to go over, I don't know, just share some highlights from the show, things that made people laugh. It was a great time. So, shout out to everybody who came to that. Oh, and shout out to Names as well, in particular, for your for the creation of the Donald Trump song. That's so good.
Names wrote and recorded a song about Donald Trump, which I have saved on my
Unbelievably
computer.
Good.
I just can't stop laughing.
It's so good. I wanted to just occasionally just make a show in like this show. So yeah. Anyways, so there's my show.
Maybe I should do the outro music to this episode as Names as Donald Trump song.
Do it. I think it would be great. Yeah. The Accursed Share.
Before we play Names as Donald Trump song, I just want to give a shout out to all the people on Patreon. Shout out to Claudia, Matt, Hieratef, Billy, Yerpel, Nick, Benji, Moog, Jaden, Hamp, Rowan, Diogo, BD Hoffs, Pavlik, Fake Gamerboy, Seabell, Jace, Yutz, Hylick, Nick, J-Man, Saint Marzano, Abraxas, and at Double Speed. Thank you,
all of you. And shout out to Jack for adding me to the Patreon.
For wasting your accursed share on us and keeping the world a safe place.
Add me to the patron, Jack. Damn it. So I can throw my accursed share in the ring with the others. May I need to become
Everyone
a supporter
who subscribed to us on Patreon is doing their bit for global peace.
By throwing off their accursed share, by beating off their accursed share at our... at foot pictures. At bonus content from me and Jack.
At our solar anus.
Hey, if you want to see Jack and I's solar anuses, beat off your accursed share and give us some of your extra shekels on Patreon, please. Join the Discord, join the Patreon.
Please.
Discord.com/bookclubfromhell. I'm pretty sure that's what it is. Let me double check. .com/bookclubfromhell. I am pretty sure I got or did I just get BCFH? I'll double check. Cut out. Oh, sorry. All right. Yeah. Shout out to everybody. Join the Discord. Join the Patreon. Thanks for listening.